Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Max Gawn, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Number 32 in my 50 most relevant players for AFL Fantasy SuperCoach and Dream Team for 2025 is one of the best picks from last year. Can he get it done again in 2025? Max Gawn, who is on the relevance and discussion points for this episode. Wow, what a smash pick for you last year. We will talk about that and the year to come. But joining me on this episode, as he has not only throughout this 50 most relevant, for the better part of almost 3 seasons he's been a part of the panel now, the Harry Sheasel of the fantasy footy community. MiniMonk, my friend, good to see you. Big Max, wow, what a year, hey? What a year.
What a year. I'm doubling up on rock duties in the 50. First Sean Darcy, rather.
Yeah.
God, that's a tongue twister. Now on to Max Gawn. And wow, if you picked him in 2024, even after what many considered was a pretty poor opening round game where he got monstered by Grundy, you're off to a flyer.
Oh, look, it might not have been the thing that defined ultimate success in your year, just with such a large percentage of the comp, but it made it very hard for you. I know the winner of AFL Fantasy didn't have him last year, but it made it very hard to make all the other variables really work for you, given how good he was. This seasonal average that he just knocked out was his pure career high in AFL Fantasy. If you want to do the 2020 adjusted average nonsense, you're welcome to do so. Not going to, but a 111.8 last year means in Fantasy and Dream Team, you are forking out over $1.1 million for him in fantasy. We are talking about one of the most expensive players in those two formats, while in SuperCoach, seasonal average of 124.1. He is just skinny of $669,000. Again, one of the most expensive players in the game because he was so good. Last year, his best scores came against the Saints. Same game. He knocked out an absolute monster for us in SuperCoach, a 180, while it was a 152 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. But you've just got to go back to 2023, so it's not exactly that far that you go back to his career scores. In AFL Fantasy, same games, both of these ones went down. A 162 against the Lions. I remember watching that game. It was amazing. And he's a part of the 200 club in SuperCoach, a 215. MiniMonk, for so long in the fantasy and SuperCoach community, we've just loved owning Max Gawn. From a value breakout ruckman nearly a decade ago, now to being one of, if not the greatest historical fantasy ruckman we have ever seen. And he did it again for us last year. In so many categories too, that a traditional ruckman doesn't do. Like 6th in the league per game for contested marks, 6th in the league for hitouts, 13th for contested possessions per game, which is just wild for a ruck. Top 20 for stoppage clearances, a stat line that is so often very clearance midfield numbers. Number 1 ruck in the league for hardball gets. 6th for hitouts to advantages last year, and top 8 in the league for total ruck contests. We're not even got to his fantasy and SuperCoach output yet. Just unbelievable scoring capacity, endurance, the work rate to get to so much, and then to do so much in and under hard stuff at the age of 32. Just wild what the Melbourne leader can do.
He certainly leads from the front. You know, he's the type of player that tries to drag his team over the line. How many times have you seen him kick a goal from outside 50 late on in the fourth quarter to give Melbourne a sniff to actually win the game? You know, I reckon he did it about 4 or 5 times in the first 10 rounds of the season last year. Yeah. It was just ridiculous. He is up there with Brodie Grundy as the best ruckman of the last 10 years in terms of fantasy output. And, you know, Grundy and Gawn kind of rival the peaks that was Sandilands and Dean Cox. These two have been stalwarts. And whilst Grundy has started to slip away a little bit in the last couple of years, Gawn has gone back up a tier. You know, since 2020, he declined a little bit, especially in AFL Fantasy, but to come back in 2024 with a career year, 111.8, and then also breaks the 120 mark in SuperCoach as well, despite having an injury-affected year.
Yeah.
There's not much more that the man can do to prove that he is a premium ruck and worthy of consideration, if not in your starting squad, for your team at some point during the season.
5 of his last 7 seasons SuperCoach, 120 plus seasonal average. 3 of the last 7 in AFL Fantasy are 110 plus. And politely, it really should be 4, given that's not factoring in the 2020 adjusted average year of AFL Fantasy with the shortened quarters and really the scoring threshold coming all the way down. But to go back to that AFL Fantasy year last year, 13 tons, 8 of them 120 plus, so unbelievable ceiling about him. 136, 137, 146, 148, a 149, and a 152. My goodness me. A 140 and a 150 in SuperCoach are massive, but in AFL Fantasy, they're even harder to get to. So this is wild numbers. And to go with that, 3 of them are under 80. 1 of them was in opening round, so it didn't even impact the points we got, impacted his price point, but didn't impact the points we got. The other was an injury impacted game that he got subbed out. 21st in the league for total points. And that's with missing 2 whole games. 4th in the league for averages. Yeah. Cherry, Marshall, Sheasel, the only guys to average more for him in AFL Fantasy. And in SuperCoach, my goodness me, this is scary. 16 tons, 10 over 120. 2 scores of 162, a 177, and that 180. And again, we talk about a basement that's super high. Just the 2 scores sub 80. He ranked 10th MiniMonk last year for total points, and he missed 2 games. He scored more points than Rowan Marshall, who is a understandably popular starting option in a set and forget ruck structure, and yet even with 2 less games, Gawn is outscoring him. He's second overall by average, and he's one of only really 3 guys that went 120 plus last year, with Bont and Butters. The others, it's just wild after wild after wild scoring capacity and ability. And in a conversation of set and forget rucks, the AFL fantasy community seemed to have disregarded him as an option, while SuperCoaches are really glad they've got the flex spot that I'm sure we'll talk about through this episode, because now there's a world you can get the best scoring options and not be skinny of one in your fantasy and SuperCoach side.
I mean, yeah, it's crazy that we could end up with 3 premium rocks in SuperCoach and Dream Team as our R1, R2, and in our flex spots. I mean, you look at that. You look at the top 4 scorers of SuperCoach last year, 3 of them were rocks. If the same trend holds, you're going to have to be able to afford to get Gawn at some point. Now, if we look at his season splits as well, if he starts 2025 like he started 2024, when is that going to be? AFL Fantasy, 137, 107, 146, 109, 144, 149, 134.
Oh.
He was averaging over 130 over the first 7 rounds of the actual scoring season.
Wow.
In SuperCoach, 162, 113, 177, 129, 138, 162. 140 average over the first 7 rounds. It becomes unaffordable to be able to get him at that point until his bye. It's just ridiculous. You compare it to the second half of the season and there's a fall off associated with his scoring, but there's narrative to it. There's reasons why. Oliver slows down, gets injured, has a lot of issues. Petrarca cops a massive hit and misses the rest of the season. Gawn himself gets injured. We understand why there's a decrease in his scoring in the second half of the season, and yet he's still able to average, just under 100 in AFL Fantasy and about 107, 108 in SuperCoach. That's not bad. If that is the floor over a 10-week period when everything goes wrong, and if things start to go wrong, right, for the Demons in 2025, that could be very, very scary if you're looking to fade him.
The Demons could not have had more things go against them last year. So many of their forwards, and their forward structure has been a challenge for them for a long period of time outside of that premiership year, that they've just not been able to get any kind of synergy or consistency about them. And Christian Petrarca became the antidote, but by doing so, it hurt their midfield because they had a Clayton Oliver who had no preseason and was struggling, Viney who was trying to carry the load. And let's not downplay the fact that for the better part of the preseason, they were expecting to have Angus Brayshaw in this midfield. And now all of a sudden, the third and fourth string option totally dynamically changes for them with little chance to grow and develop something. And so historically bad midfield performance around them. They were, from a fantasy perspective, the fourth lowest team in SuperCoach and 13th in AFL Fantasy, because their forward line was misfunctioning. Their midfield was either injured, struggling with injury, or unable to play due to a forced retirement. And as good as the likes of Lever and May have been as warriors for this club down back, it felt like time upon time, the damn wall just broke for Melbourne, especially in that back half of the year when Gawn couldn't fix and hold all the pieces of this team together. The moment Petrarca went down, the numbers of Gawn, whether it's causation or correlation, that can be another conversation, but it did feel like that became the straw that broke the Demons back. Oliver can't get there. There's no Brayshaw. Petrarca now can't fix the gaps. Gawn is carrying so much of this team, and it felt like just Lever, May just couldn't stop the damn wall coming anymore. How do you see a Melbourne team responding? Because they were historically bad for a team that's got stars across certainly their midfield and defensive lines, and we can include forward line if you want to include Petrarca. I think Cozzy Pickett is underrated in the AFL community as well. What's the pathway to them improving? Because while it doesn't feel like it links to Gawn, definitely from a SuperCoach, the rising tide of a Melbourne side will ultimately take some challenging data points for Gawn right up to a whole nother level.
It will. I think the first thing is a fit Clayton Oliver. You know, if you've got a Clayton Oliver who plays an entire season and looks 90% of what his peak is as opposed to 60 to 70%, that's going to make a huge difference in terms of their contested game, in terms of Gawn being able to get hit-outs to advantage, in terms of just them generally scoring more as a team. As you said, the Gus Brayshaw retirement in 2024, like right at the start of the season, meant they had to completely pivot what their midfield structure was going to be. They've now had a year and a bit to figure out what is their structure going to be for 2025. Who is their first tier 3 into the CBA? Who is their fourth and fifth rotations? You know, is it a Trent Rivers that goes through there? Is it someone else that they try? Is it Salem? Who knows? But at least they'll have a bit more time, stability, ability to be able to figure out what it is that works for them. And a fit Christian Petrarca. I know he's had the setback already so far this preseason, but he's back in training. He should be fine. You know, it's a rib tickler. They'll know how to manage him properly, hopefully, this time. I don't think it was quite as bad as the hit that he had during the season in 2024.
No, not at all.
But you've got two fit players at their top tier, who are undeniably top 20 midfielders in the AFL when they're at their peak. And you've got time to fix that midfield dynamic out. Then you should start to see a regression back to the mean, a regression back to them being able to score properly, get midfield clearances, and Max could be able to get hit-outs to advantage. And, you know, I've looked into some of the stats on it. If you look at, you know, the ruck hit-outs, ruck contest, hit-out to advantage percentage, I'm going to go back to 2021 when he was probably at his peak. Because I'd say that 2022, 2023, 2024 are, you know, a bit different. 2021, ruck contest per game, about 87.5 for Melbourne, but it's above the league average at that point by about 2 per game. Max Gawn was winning about 50% of those ruck contests.
Wow.
And he was getting about 30% of those to advantage, which is phenomenal numbers.
Unbelievable numbers.
You compare that to 2024, they've got 89 ruck contests per game, but it's 6 below the league average now. If you put him just back at the league average and he goes back to winning 50% of them, that's actually another nearly 10 hit-outs per game for Gawn, because his hit-out percentage dropped to 41% during 2024. And his to advantage percentage dropped about 4% as well. So you're saying you can get another 4% of another 6 or so hitouts per game. That's pretty good. And it's even better when you compare it to the last 10 when there was no Christian Petrarca, Gawn was sore, Oliver was sore. They were down at the second worst team for ruck contests per game. Wow. There was only 36% of hitouts that they were winning, and only 28% of them were to advantage. Just alone from where we know that Max Gawn can be at his most dominant, which is hitouts to advantage to the midfielders who can then get involved in the scoring chains, that alone is where you can see upside in him. And it's not easy to say that there's an upside in a guy that's put on a career year in AFL Fantasy at 111 and at 124 average in SuperCoach and being the second highest averaging player in the game.
The new year is the perfect time to start fresh. So why not make it delicious? Start your day with Bob's Red Mill 100% whole grain oats. One simple ingredient with endless possibilities. Whether you're a sweetness savorer or a good health guru, with Bob's Red Mill, you can have a naturally delicious breakfast made your way. So savor your mornings with premium oats, perfected by nature and made to be shared. No matter how you top your oats, you're always welcome at our table. Look for Bob's Red Mill oats in the blue bag.
Hey, Atlanta. Say hello to Small Business Help from Apple. That's right. We're here to make starting and running your business simpler. From helping you choose the right devices to setting them up hassle-free, we can help you build your business in no time. Speak to a business expert and get the help you need at no cost whatsoever. At Apple, we're open for your small business. Go to apple.com/small business or visit an Apple store to learn more.
Those are not difficult numbers to believe are foreseeable. Because again, it's like making a budget a year out. If you put it on an Excel spreadsheet, it's like, this balance is easy, problem solved. But it's like, now you've got to make that $17 million to balance your sheet. What you've given us is not this unjustifiable pathway to go, it's literally comprehensible, simple, easy to do changes, which take a guy that is already top of his line in SuperCoach, barely not the top ruckman in fantasy, and with a justifiable reason for a slow back. Like, you talk just the front 8 weeks, it's still at the mid-season buys. It's 120 plus in AFL Fantasy and 130 in SuperCoach. So one of the big objections I've heard to not starting Max Gawn, and there's a couple that I think are all have some relevance to consider, is we are paying top dollar for him. But as the better part of 2/3 of last year, let alone some historical bad data points that have gone alongside this, there is a world where he can get back to those monster SuperCoach years, and which is crazy to say a 120 plus isn't a monster, but he's got some wild SuperCoach numbers, let alone actually being, if someone said to me, tell me a ruckman that you would say could get a 120 average in fantasy and average over 130 in SuperCoach, the one ruckman I would say I believe could do it is Gawn. The other two are amazing in Marshall and Cherry, but in terms of all the variables going his way, zero contesting elements at all, and then his ability to be involved in every dynamic of the game, Gawn is the one that could hit unparalleled heights that a ruckman has never seen before.
He drifts back, he goes forward, he kicks goals, he gets hit out to advantage, he gets tackles. His score build is about as diverse as it can get for a ruckman. And there's still scope to grow. You know, you're talking about doing 130 in SuperCoach. He's done that before. Yes, it was in the shortened quarters, but it wasn't just nearly 130. It was nearly 140. It was 139.9. And it's not like that was out of the trend, because the 2 years before that, he'd done a 127 and a 128. So he has 3 years above what he is priced at for 2025 in SuperCoach. And yes, it's a career year in AFL Fantasy as well, but it's not uncharted territories. It's a career year by half a point per game.
Yeah.
It's not much.
No.
And you're talking about a player that's had an injury-affected year as well. That's really not much to really scoff at. And as you say, there are two ruckmen that a lot of coaches are considering a lot more heavily who are priced above him in AFL Fantasy, at least in Marshall and Cherry. This is the career year for Cherry so far. And Marshall has had a few years of being in and around this marker, but it's still his career year as well. So you're talking about 3 ruckmen who've got career years. One's selected by about 55% of teams. One's selected by about 30% of teams. And Gawn's selected by 6%.
Oh,
There's your point of difference.
unbelievable. When you're paying $1.1 million in Fantasy and Dream Team and nearing towards $700,000 in SuperCoach, you are needing them to, at bare minimum, hold the average point in terms of scoring with the ideal intent they can marginally outperform that, and is someone you're happy to put a VC or a C on early days. Whether or not you keep them for the year, the keeper mindset, the top of their line mindset, that is a conversation that we'll have in the preseason that we're not going to deep dive on Gawn with. But for Gawn or any top end player to deliver value, and by value I don't just mean in performing dollars to points, I'm talking about value for what you're paying for. He must go at minimum what he's priced at, with a real need to outperform that by 5 to 10 points per game. If we were to look at the first kind of 6 games of the year, now he doesn't have an opening round stoppage, so that helps. These are the teams, and just using 2024 data point, I'll give you the last 10 opponents and tell you where it sits. Obviously, there's always the variables of the rucks, is it wet, all that stuff, but let's just stay right at the top of the tree for now. They play the Giants. For Fantasy and SuperCoach, it's pretty mid-range movers. You know, it's negligible points for, points against. North Melbourne is similar, who they've got in round 2. And the Suns, if Witts is playing, it's pretty mid-range. Then some interesting matchups. The Cats, who they have 4th over the last 10 weeks of 2024, were the 3rd easiest in Fantasy and the 2nd easiest in SuperCoach. And gosh, that could be chaotic if that's someone like a Conway. Gosh, let's be honest, any Cats ruck, it could be chaotic.
Or even an SDK.
Oh, yeah, it could be chaotic. The Bombers, who they have in round 5, using the last 10 again, the variable of is it Draper, is it Goldstein, or a combination of both changes everything. But using the last 10 data point games of last year, they were the hardest matchup. And then the Dockers, 4th easiest over the last 10 of 2024 in Fantasy, 7th easiest in SuperCoach. So there's 1 or 2 really, really nice matchups, one potentially the hardest, and a couple that are negligible. Using those opponents, do you see a pathway
hang on a second.
He can knock out? Go on.
Hang on a second. You're selling him short. I'm not sure if you've done this deliberately or not. But have you looked who they've got in round 7 and round 8?
No, I'm not mentioning that at all.
Round 7 and round 8, you go back to back into Richmond and West Coast.
Thank you.
Probably the 2 friendliest ruck matchups for the entirety of the 2024 season. And you're saying that he has them in back-to-back weeks, including the Richmond game being on a Thursday night for vice-captaincy potential as well?
Maybe busted here.
If you are missing out on that, and the game against Geelong's on a Friday night as well, vice-captaincy potential there, you know, there is absolutely a world where he goes 130 AFL Fantasy and 140 SuperCoach over a 5-week block from round 4 to round 8. If there's no dual ruck set up at Essendon, it's all lights green for Gawn in that time period. If you are starting the season with a ruckman that you're not happy with, that's just trading water, let's say you start a Cherry or a Marshall or a TDK isn't quite going where you need him to be.
Sure.
If you see that run coming up and you have the luxury trades at that point, because at round 3, you're probably just a week short of being able to do the upgrades at that point.
Yep.
That might be your point to say, I'm jumping off. I'm going straight to Gawn. I think that he can match it with the other 2. And here's my point of difference.
He's the kind of guy that even if you're a Darcy, a Flynn truther, like use Darcy maybe as the illustration point. We know when he's fit, he's going to be in the upper echelons, maybe not top of the line, but in the upper tiers of rucks, and will outperform his price point comfortably, regardless of if he gets back to that, groundbreaking years that put him at the top of his line and, 100 plus averages. Even if after 4 or 5 weeks of 2 price movements in SuperCoach, 4 or 5 price movements in fantasy, if you're like, I want to get off the risk profile, I just want out, I'm going to take my points, I'm going to take my games, and I'm going to just jump. Cats, gravy matchup. Bombers, if it's single ruck, probably gravy matchup. Dockers, good matchup, even with Darcy in there, by the way, let alone then the Tigers. And even if it is Matthew Flynn, which I believe it will be, as the Eagles ruck, Gawn destroys that 5.
It's still gravy.
Round 5 to 8, you could argue, were the most important 4 weeks of the season. And if you get that 125, 130 range of Gawn and that 130 to 140 range of Gawn in SuperCoach, that is season-defining moves. So he's an interesting guy, but there's one thing we haven't talked about. He's, at time of recording, he's not in full preseason training. He's not the only player on the 50 most relevant that's happened to. Maybe we'll have one of them soon. Who knows? But he's not in full training. Look, he fractured his voice box. So a horribly horrific, painful injury. He's not doing contest work, but his ability to do the important part of preseason, that's not been hindered, which is an important thing to consider.
It is.
So,
look,
the conversation. No, yeah. I want to ask you about one last thing. Again, we're spending a lot of time around Gawn and rucks because I think we just need to bring some balance in the AFL fantasy community. I think super coaches are already rightfully licking their lips at what he could be. And again, you've clearly pointed out the run. Whether it's a start or a very sharp upgrade cadence, where and why you should be getting into Gawn. This ruck structure conversation is so interesting to me this year. We had a great chat a couple of days ago with Mitch Casey from Fantasy Ball Boys about Tom de Koning. You and I had a conversation about Sean Darcy. Pig Mentality jumped in the 50 most relevant too, talking about Matt Flynn. Like, this ruck structure decisions changes everything about how you can balance out certain other lines. And Gawn feels like the one that broadly across the community, we're not giving enough credit that he could very easily continue on how he started last year. Very easily.
The set and forget narrative that's being pushed so far in the community this preseason across everywhere that I've seen is if you're wanting to set 2 ruckmen to start off with, it's Marshall and Cherry. And yet, Gawn is right there. He's pricier in SuperCoach, of course, but that's because he averaged more.
Yeah.
He averaged a little bit less in AFL Fantasy, but still got over the 110 marker. And you could say there's a little bit of juicy value in there. And as I outlined before, the ownership percentage in AFL Fantasy clearly shows that it's not just what's happening on Twitter or what's happening on Discord or what's happening on Reddit or Big Footy or wherever people go to get their fantasy advice. It's pretty clear that a lot of people see it the same way. So if you're wanting to go a set and forget strategy, why not go against the grain? Why not say, you know what? I really like Marshall's opening run. Don't like Cherries. Let's go Gawn instead. That is a very easy way to separate. People are talking about we need to spend our money somewhere. We've got so much value in the forward line. We've got so much value in the midline. I'm going to spend up in the rucks. I'm going to spend up in the defenders. He's sitting right there. He's done 110 before in AFL Fantasy. He's done 125 plus in SuperCoach. He's done nearly 140 in SuperCoach. That's just the way to separate your ruck structure. It doesn't take much in your opening squad, your round 1 team, to separate yourself from the pack. And as I said, at a 6% ownership in AFL Fantasy, and I suspect it's probably going to be a similar level in Dream Team and SuperCoach as well, that's something tasty to take on.
If you want to play devil's advocate around those other top-line rucks. You could say Marshall's got 2 youngsters coming through. One as an SSP, one through the draft, that could and should build the narrative to take some spaces, and that he would be the best tall forward option to support Max King. A conversation and a narrative around Tristan Cherry could be, for this team to improve, other dynamics have to move, and there are some unbelievably abnormal highs for a ruck with some of his scoring ways of building his scoring build.
Steve Fizz, is that you?
Hello. Yes, this is what he looks like. Hello, Draft Doctor friends. He'll be on the podcast in about a week and a half, just so you know, for the 50 most relevant. And then Gawn, you talked about, while there are some high numbers, some of those hit outs to advantage elements, scary, scary low. And unlike a Marshall, if you said, what's the pathway to competition for Marshall? Well, it's youngsters, but it's there. For Cherry, it's not really there. For for the D's, come on now. If Tom Campbell is a serious threat to you, you need to about face. He is nothing more than an insurance policy and a great clubman. Yep. That is all he is. Gawn is going to take the bulk share. They are still pushing for a premiership when you have Petrarca in his age prime, Oliver in his age prime, Viney in his age prime, May and Lever in their age primes, or in May's case, the back end of it, and Max Gawn, one of, if not the greatest ruckman we have ever seen in football. Come on now. This is not a team that's North Melbourneing it and trying to develop. This is a team that is going all out for the flag. And so, do you have to start him? Of course not. But what we're trying to do throughout this episode, from the flex to the pathway to the little bit of in-baked value that's there, to that early fixture run that kind of sits there, to the uniqueness in AFL fantasy, to the conversations around set and forget. All we're trying to do with this episode around Max Gawn for the 50 most relevant is say, he was so good last year. And outside of he's a year older, there's not a real valid conversation to me to say he couldn't at least maintain. If you choose others, that's fine. I'll hear that conversation. That's different. But to disregard Gawn feels disrespectful to who he has been for us and how he can score for us. Mini, I think he's a guy that if he hasn't been a consideration for you to start, you probably got to about face and just think what it was like if you didn't own Gawn last year, just the frustrating Friday nights and Saturdays that it gave you.
As someone who was a non-owner for, I think, the entirety of the year, it was frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting how you haven't done the segue in, so I might do it this time.
Please do.
The one place in the community where he is getting the respect, at least at the moment, is the draft community.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you the question, where do you think he gets drafted? And where do you think he should be drafted?
Great question. This one for me, positional. Scarcity is always the factor. How many players in your league, how many on field, and formats. It changes, but not by much. And the only thing it changes for me is in SuperCoach, he's the clear first ruck off the board to me. As good as the others are to me, he is the clear number one off the board, and a conversation for the first picked overall. Has to be in SuperCoach to me. Yep. In AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, I understand why he'd be the third ruck off the board. But to me, again, depending on how many other positions need to be on field, how many are in your league, there is a valid conversation that he's a first rounder. I think he's probably more, if it's a 5-7-1-5, 10-team league in fantasy on the keeper platform, which is where the coaches panel choose to draft, to me, he's probably a late first, early second. You throw some positional scarcity, it goes up higher and higher. Where's your take across those two formats? Where are you picking our friend Max Gawn?
He can't fall outside the top three in SuperCoach, in my opinion. I mean, just based on history, longevity, positional scarcity, and relative fitness, like he's played almost all games of every season. I think he has to be a top three pick there. If he gets to the turn in AFL Fantasy, I think you're laughing. If you're a pick 7, pick 8, pick 9, and he's getting to you, I would be taking that up. I think he probably goes around about the pick 5, pick 6 marker.
Yeah.
And
it's
I think
interesting.
that is probably about fair value.
Yeah. You can throw a blanket over, in drafting, 10 names who are the top tier mids, like comfortably, who you would get at pick 5 versus pick 16. You'd feel like you're basically picking the same 1 or 2 points per game scoring option, whereas that gap where Gawn can and is matching it with the top 2 right through to what the 4th ruck or the 10th ruck is substantial. Again, the variables of teams on field, all that stuff sits, but I'm with you. If you are sitting there in the mid-second round in fantasy and Big M Gawn is still sitting there, even if you're not an early ruck drafter, you just can't ignore a gift horse that's looking at you in the mouth. To me, I think he's the one. Hey, mate, I've loved talking about Max Gawn with you. He's part of the intro of the podcast, so we're definitely a fan of Big Maximum. But thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you about a player that I think is going to really surprise us. And as the whole series is about, be relevant for us, whether we start, fade, upgrade, or don't get to in 2025. Thank you, mate.
I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this shakes up in the community. And it's always a pleasure to be able to chat to you on these podcasts.
If you want to check out any of the other players we've revealed so far in the 50 most relevant as an audio podcast or a video, ultimately, wherever you're checking out this episode, the whole series is there. So maybe you're just getting your preseason really started. Maybe it's like, okay, it's heading to sort of, the latter portion of January now. Gosh, it's under 50 days away till, the season starts. I probably should get my butt into gear. Okay. Go back and check it out. The design of these series has always been about starting the conversation, helping you make informed decisions for your team across the format you play. If you're watching this on YouTube, nice to see you. Comment below. Let me know, what do you think he's going to average this year across the formats? One of the most fascinating players to have a conversation about this preseason is Max Gawn. And if you're listening to this as an audio podcast and you haven't given us a 5-star rating, or on Apple Podcasts if you're listening there, and given us a review, chuck it in there. If you do a nice one, we'll read it out. Even if you do a horrible one, I'll probably read it out as well. So you can jump in there and do that and take care of us. And in the description of the episode is all the details. We can get in touch with us across social media, gain access to our Patreon, where there's a bunch of tiers and rewards, and a couple of unique surprises coming through that, especially if you're a draft player, whether it be a single season or you like a keeper league or want to try one, you might get some early opportunities on the Keeper platform as a Patreon. I probably said too much, but Patreons are getting some love from Keeper and the Coaches Panel in 2025. And also the details to get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch. All right, you want to know who's number 31 in the 50 most relevant? I'm not going to tell you who the guest is. But what I will tell you is this. I've alluded to this player by a type throughout this episode. He is someone that in his line is undoubtedly been expected to be by the community one of, if not the best in his line at multiple junctions and points in his career. He's got close a couple of times, but he's never been a top liner. If this team hands him the keys to the kingdom in 2025, then I can see a pathway where across one, if not all the formats, he's one of, if not the best scorer in his line. But there's been a little hiccup this preseason. But what is that hiccup? And is it a structural piece? Is it an injury piece? Is it a defined game style piece that might prevent him from finally being able to unlock his fantasy footy potential? Who is he? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.